There are stories that unfold slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Images that emerge one detail at a time until a forgotten memory comes fully into view. This one began in the summer of 2004, under the suffocating heat of Central Florida, when a 19-year-old university sophomore named Emily Torres stepped off a dusty white van into the leafy shadows of the Oak Ridge Primate Sanctuary, clutching a notebook and a borrowed digital camera. She had just started her internship, wide-eyed and uncertain, not yet aware that one of the deepest bonds of her life was waiting behind a steel-reinforced gate. The gorilla's name was Kanzi. He was just 2 years old then, already heavy-limbed and cautious, with a scar along his left shoulder from the metal trap that had almost killed him in Cameroon. His arrival at the sanctuary had been quiet. No press, no headlines, just a single box unloaded by 2 exhausted men who looked away when the door was opened. Kanzi didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stared. Emily had never seen eyes like his before. "It felt like he saw through me," she would say years later. Not in a magical way, just purely, without filters. She had been assigned to help feed, clean, and document behavior. At first, Kanzi didn't come near, but she returned every morning, sitting outside his enclosure for hours with her notebook, reading aloud from whatever book she had brought that week. Jane Goodall, Steinbeck, a biology textbook. It didn't matter. 3 weeks in, he placed his palm against the glass. She pressed hers back. By late July, he would greet her with a grunt and a soft chest tap, a sign of recognition, of comfort. Sanctuary staff noticed. He responded to her in ways he didn't with others, the head caretaker recalled. He followed her voice. He ate better, slept better. The internship ended in August. Emily hugged her supervisors, packed her bags, and promised she'd visit. She never did. Life moved quickly. Graduate school, a research fellowship, her mother's illness, a job offer in Portland, marriage, then a divorce. The years unfolded like pages turning too fast to read. Kanzi remained. Over time, she stopped searching his name online. The sanctuary posted fewer updates, then none. She assumed he had been relocated or died. The quiet kind of assumption that becomes convenient over time, protective even, until one rainy evening in May of 2023, nearly 20 years after that summer, she opened her email and saw a subject line she almost deleted. "You might want to see this." It was from an old colleague. Inside was a short video clip, no context, just grainy footage of a gray-backed gorilla sitting in a large naturalistic enclosure, his breathing slow, his gaze fixed on the fence, where a volunteer was humming faintly while stacking fruit crates. The gorilla shifted. He grunted, and then, unmistakably, he tapped his chest twice. Her hands trembled as she hit play again. And again. The email included a link to the sanctuary's revamped site. Oak Ridge had expanded, now open to private visitors. By appointment only. She didn't think. She booked the flight. Orlando, then a 2-hour drive south. The sky was overcast when she arrived, as if echoing the weight in her chest. She didn't tell anyone the real reason for her visit, not at first. The director greeted her with formal politeness. "We've had him for over 20 years now," he said, walking her through the updated enclosures. "Still healthy, quiet, doesn't connect much anymore." He paused. He remembers faces. Not many, but some. Emily didn't respond. Her fingers gripped the railing as they approached the observation deck. There, in the far corner, under the shade of an artificial tree, Kanzi sat. Larger now, massive and still, with streaks of silver along his arms and chest. His eyes were half closed, almost meditative. She exhaled, slowly. The air felt too thick. She called his name. Just once. And then, he turned. For a moment, time seemed to dislocate. Not stop, not rewind, just bend. Emily stood frozen, her breath caught between disbelief and fragile hope. Kanzi didn't move. His eyes, deeper now, clouded slightly with age but unmistakably alert, locked onto hers. There was no dramatic reaction. No sudden rush to the fence. Only silence. Long, heavy, intimate. She almost looked away, almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Then, slowly, deliberately, Kanzi leaned forward, his head tilted just slightly, as if calibrating the image in front of him, the same way he used to when she read out loud all those years ago. She whispered again, his name, barely audible. He took one step, then another, and another, until he reached the edge of the enclosure. There was a thick, reinforced glass wall now, safer, cleaner, more modern, but sterile somehow. The kind of barrier that forgets how much feeling exists on either side of it. She raised her hand, and just like he had done nearly 2 decades earlier, He raised his own and pressed his palm to the glass. Only this time, there was no hesitation. Staff watching from a distance noticed the interaction but didn't interrupt. They knew better. Moments like this weren't protocol. They were personal, sacred. Emily's eyes welled up, but no tears fell. Not yet. She just watched him. Observed the way his chest expanded, the low, rhythmic sound he made, part hum, part breath. He was older, yes, but the rhythm was familiar. She remembered that sound from long ago. He made it when he was calm, when he felt safe. "I can't believe you remember me," she said, voice cracking. Kanzi didn't flinch. He leaned into the glass, resting the side of his face against it. For a second, just a second, it looked like he closed his eyes. She stayed there for over an hour, talking softly, not expecting answers, just filling the space with words. Some were updates about her life, her regrets, the things she never got to say. Others were questions, things she knew she'd never get answers to. "Did you ever wonder if I'd come back? Did you think I left because I didn't care? Did you wait?" At one point, she pulled out a small laminated photograph from her coat pocket. It was a picture taken on her last day at the sanctuary, printed from an old disposable camera. She was younger, in a green staff shirt, kneeling next to the glass, and Kanzi, just a lanky teenager then, was mimicking her posture. She pressed it against the glass. He stared at it. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he tapped his chest twice. The same gesture, the same signal. Emily had to sit down. She wasn't sure how long she stayed after that. The sky began to darken. A light drizzle misted the glass between them like a curtain pulling in. The sanctuary staff gently reminded her of visiting hour limits. She nodded, thanked them, and promised she'd return the next day, and the next. Back at her rented motel room, she didn't sleep. She reviewed the footage on her phone over and over, watched the way Kanzi moved, noted how his right arm seemed slower, stiffer than she remembered, Googled symptoms, gorilla lifespan, arthritis, muscle degeneration. She wasn't a vet, but she still had her instincts. She began taking notes again. Behavior, expression, vocalizations. It was instinctual, like muscle memory, not for research, for understanding. The following morning, she arrived before opening hours. The staff allowed it, part curiosity, part compassion. Not everyone connected with a primate after 2 decades. Not like this. Over the next days, she became part of the rhythm of the sanctuary again. A visitor, yes, but something more. Kanzi began waiting for her at the same spot. She brought books again. Old ones, the same ones. She read aloud. He listened. Sometimes he turned away. Sometimes he simply sat with his back to her. But he stayed close. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. Emily had just finished a chapter from Of Mice and Men. Her voice cracked on the last line. She paused, and instead of speaking again, she just rested her forehead against the glass. Kanzi walked to the far side of the enclosure, picked up a fallen branch, brought it back to her. He dropped it at the base of the glass. A gift. In the wild, gorillas do this. They offer objects, small tokens, not always with obvious purpose, but always with intention. She knew this, and yet standing there, watching that branch rest awkwardly between them, she felt something unspoken pass through the air, a message too large for words, a gesture of forgiveness, or maybe remembrance. Maybe both. She smiled, not the kind meant for cameras, the kind that lives behind the ribs. She pressed both hands to the glass and whispered, "I'm here now." Kanzi sat down. He didn't touch the glass again. He just sat, close, still. And for the first time in years, Emily felt returned to. There is a silence that exists between beings who have known one another beyond words. Not the kind born from awkwardness or absence, but the kind that carries the weight of everything that no longer needs to be said. That's what settled between Emily and Kanzi in the days that followed. The kind of silence that filled the space like a shared breath. She came every morning, often before the sun broke through the thin Florida fog, carrying her travel mug, a worn notebook, and the same green windbreaker she used to wear during her internship. The sanctuary staff no longer asked questions. They simply opened the gate and let her in. A quiet understanding had settled around her presence, an unspoken acknowledgement that what was unfolding didn't belong in paperwork or visitor logs. Kanzi had claimed a corner near the glass, where the morning sun hit just right. He would sit with his legs tucked beneath him, eyes closed, breathing slow and deep. Sometimes he didn't react when she arrived. Other times, he would glance up and grunt softly, a sound of welcome or tolerance. She couldn't always tell, but he never walked away. The rituals grew. She read aloud for exactly 45 minutes, always from the same copy of The Grapes of Wrath, the pages yellowed and underlined. She had once read it to him in her final week, thinking he wouldn't understand. Now every time her voice carried across the glass, he sat straighter. After reading, She would tell him stories about her mother's garden, about rain in Oregon, about the smell of sea air near Monterey where she once lived for 3 months. He never responded, but there were moments, fleeting, intimate, where he would tilt his head or shift his weight, as if listening for something between the syllables. And then, one afternoon, he didn't show up. Emily waited for 2 hours, walked the perimeter of the enclosure, spoke quietly to the staff. "He's probably just resting," they said. "He has off days." But worry bloomed anyway. Not loud or frantic, slow and familiar, like a shadow stretching across the floor. The next morning she returned even earlier. Kanzi was near the back of the enclosure, lying on his side, not asleep, just still. A vet came by mid-morning to observe him. Nothing serious, older age, slower joints, mild dehydration. He needed time. "He's not young anymore," the vet reminded her gently. Emily nodded, but her heart shrank. That night, she didn't sleep. She walked the motel parking lot under dull orange lights, pacing, thinking. This reunion had felt like a return, but now she questioned its purpose. Had she come back too late? Was this some cruel symmetry? Their time ending just as it had begun, on the edge of summer, heavy with uncertainty? The following day, she brought an apple. Kanzi used to love apples. As a juvenile, he would hoard them, hide them beneath blankets or behind tree trunks. Emily had once snuck him a slice during a storm. The memory came to her without warning. She pressed the apple to the glass. He didn't move for a long time, but slowly he stood. His movements were careful now, deliberate, the way aging bodies protect themselves from sharp pain. He walked to her, sat down, and placed his hand on the glass. She placed the apple there, holding it with 2 fingers. He stared, and then, softly, he tapped the glass 3 times. A new rhythm, not the greeting, something else. Emily didn't know what it meant, but it felt like permission. Later that afternoon, she met with the sanctuary director. She wanted to ask what she hadn't dared to before. "Would it be possible," she said, voice low, "to be allowed inside the enclosure?" The director shook his head before she even finished. "He's still a wild animal, Emily," he said. "He remembers you, yes, but that's not the same as trust. We've kept him safe all these years because we respect that boundary." "I'm not trying to break protocol," she said. "I just want to be near him, without glass." "Just once." He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Even Jane Goodall didn't cross certain lines," he replied. "We don't let emotions compromise the safety of the animals, or the people." She left quietly, understanding but aching. Back in her motel room, she wrote a letter. To Kanzi, not for anyone else. Just 2 pages of memories, apologies, and something that resembled love. The kind of love that doesn't demand, doesn't expect. It simply exists, enduring, quiet, and undramatic. The next morning, she brought it with her, folded neatly. She placed it near the glass, behind the apple. Kanzi came slowly. Read nothing, of course, but he picked up the paper, sniffed it, then gently pressed it back to the glass. She took it as a response. The silence returned after that. Not out of distance, but comfort. They didn't need the words anymore. They had rituals, time, presence. But even in the stillness, Emily began to feel something else creeping in. An awareness that this couldn't last forever. The 4th week began with rain. Not the heavy tropical kind that soaked the ground in minutes, but a persistent drizzle that made everything seem slower, quieter. The sanctuary grounds were empty that morning except for 2 staff members and Emily, whose coat was already damp by the time she reached the observation deck. The rain streaked the glass, distorting her reflection into something younger, something older, something tired. Kanzi didn't come right away. She waited anyway, as she always did, cross-legged on the bench, notebook in her lap, a thermos between her hands. Her eyes scanned the enclosure slowly, carefully. He was near the artificial boulders, sitting, unmoving, his back to her. He didn't turn. That was the first day. On the second, he stayed in the far corner, ate very little, refused to respond to calls. The vet examined him again. Minor inflammation, muscle tightness. Nothing alarming, they said. "He's aging," the staff reminded her. "It's natural. They slow down, like we all do." But Emily couldn't accept it. Not entirely. Not now. On the 3rd day, she tried something different. She didn't speak, didn't read. She just sat beside the glass in silence, mirroring his posture. She watched his breathing, matched it, watched how he blinked slowly, as if time itself had thickened between movements. The wind shifted late that afternoon. The air smelled like wet wood and soil, and for a single moment, Kanzi lifted his head. He looked toward the glass, toward her. No sound, no gesture, just acknowledgement. That was enough. That night, the sanctuary director asked to speak with her privately. His tone was gentle, but firm. "Emily, we love having you here. You've brought something to Kanzi that we haven't seen in a long time, but we have to think about his needs in the long term. He's entering a more fragile stage now. He needs quiet, stability." Her heart dropped. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No, not yet, but I need you to prepare for that possibility. He knows you're here. He remembers. That matters. But this isn't forever." She understood. Of course she did, but it didn't hurt less. That evening, she drove past the sanctuary and kept going. For nearly 2 hours. No destination, just movement. She pulled off at a gas station off Highway 71 and cried for the first time in weeks. Not from guilt or sadness or even fear, from inevitability. Kanzi had lived through things no creature should, had survived loss, trauma, relocation, and still, he recognized love when it came back, even after all that time. Emily wondered if she could do the same. She returned the next morning with a new plan. No reading, no watching, no waiting. She brought a small speaker and set it beside the glass. Then, she played something she hadn't heard in years. Her own voice, recorded on an old mini-cassette during her internship. The quality was poor, muffled by time, but still clear enough. "Hi, buddy," the voice crackled. "It's me again. Today I'm going to read you a poem, okay? It's about wind. I think you'll like it." Kanzi didn't react right away, but eventually he turned. His movements were slow, careful. He approached the glass, one step at a time, sat down, and just listened. For over 20 minutes he sat there, his eyes half closed, ears flicking, breath steady. Emily didn't speak. She didn't move. She just let her younger self speak for her. When the recording ended, there was silence again. But this time, it didn't ache. It held something softer, something like peace. Kanzi stood up, walked to the base of the glass, and with effort, raised his hand. She met it, palm to palm, through the glass, like it had always been. And then he turned away. It was subtle, not sad, not cold, just final. A decision. Emily stayed until sundown. The staff gave her extra time. No one said anything. They didn't need to. That night, she packed. The suitcase was already closed when the sun began to rise. Emily stood by the window of her motel room, watching the light stretch over the parking lot like a slow tide. She hadn't slept, but she didn't feel tired. Not in the usual way. What she felt was something quieter. The kind of stillness that follows the closing of a door. Not with force, but with care. She had made a decision. She wouldn't go back to the sanctuary that morning. Not to say goodbye. Not to watch from behind the glass one last time. Not to risk turning a peaceful ending into something heavy. The moment had already happened, and he had made it clear, in the way only an old gorilla could, that he had nothing left to ask of her. No demand, no bitterness, just memory, and a kind of calm detachment that came not from forgetting, but from acceptance. So she sat down, pulled out the notebook she had carried with her for weeks, and wrote. Not about the science, not about behavioral patterns or conservation data. She wrote about presence, about how some relationships live entirely in silences, about how forgiveness doesn't always sound like a word, but sometimes like a slow breath, a long pause, or 3 soft taps on the glass. When she checked out, the woman at the motel counter asked if she was in town for work. Emily smiled. "Not exactly," she said. "I was visiting someone I hadn't seen in a long time." The drive to the airport was quiet. Flat roads, wide skies, Spanish moss dangling from power lines. Emily let the landscape pass without anchoring to any of it. She didn't need to hold on. The holding had already happened. At the gate, she paused before turning in her rental car, opened the glove box and pulled out a photograph she had forgotten she'd tucked there. It was the one of her and Kanzi from years ago, his young face alert beside hers, both of them framed by a glass panel that even then had felt thinner than it looked. She slipped the photo into her book. 2 months passed, then 4. Back in Portland, life resumed, but not in the way it had been before. Emily found herself moving differently, not slower, but with more intention. She noticed details she used to rush past. The sound of gravel underfoot, the way her neighbor's dog wagged its tail with the same rhythm every morning. She began volunteering again, not at primate sanctuaries, but at a local rescue center. Domestic animals, simpler cases, but the connection was the same. One evening, she gave a talk at a small university. The subject was human-primate bonding. It was meant to be academic, clinical, but halfway through, she paused. "There's a moment," she said, "when you realize that what you gave wasn't lost. It was stored, in a place memory can't touch, but instinct still recognizes." The room was silent. She didn't show photos. She didn't name Kanzi. That story belonged somewhere else, somewhere quieter. A few weeks later, she received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a small envelope with a letter from one of the sanctuary staff members. The note was brief. "He's doing fine. He doesn't sit by the glass anymore. But when it rains, he hums." There was no explanation, no signature, but she understood. She placed the letter in the same drawer where she kept her old sanctuary ID, the mini-cassette recordings, and the notebook filled with words he would never read. Not because she needed to revisit them, but because some goodbyes don't require closing. Some just need to be left open, gently.